Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the June Enterprise Risk Management Toolbox Training webinar. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. If you've dialed in by phone but haven't logged in by computer and you'd like to see the slides that will be shown during the webinar, please point your web browser to readytalk.com. In the box that says Participant Join a Meeting, enter the code that you use to join this call, 9879821. On the next screen, just scroll down to the bottom, enter your name and email address, and click the button to register, and you will be put into the webinar. Please stay aware of the level of background noise in your area, and if it becomes noisy, please put your phone on mute. If your phone doesn't have a mute feature, you can use the ReadyTalk mute functions, which are *6 to mute and *7 to unmute. Similarly, if you're called away from the phone, please do not put your phone on hold because that will cause your hold music to be transmitted to everybody else. You can simply hang up and dial back in when you're available, and it will not disrupt the call. We are leaving the phone lines open and unmuted, although I will be monitoring and can individually mute lines if there is background noise. But we are leaving them open, so if you have questions, please feel free to raise them as they come up. You can also use the chat screen in the bottom left corner of the screen. I will be monitoring that, and we'll let our presenter know when there's a question for his attention. Given that, I will hand the controls over to our presenter now. Eri?
Well, good morning, and welcome to the June ERM Toolbox training. This month, as far as the focus that we're going on, our subject is real-world ERM. So one of those you can't say very quickly, too fast there, or too many times. But we just came off our Risk Summit, our 10th annual Risk Summit that was hosted in Ontario, and we had a great turnout, over about 750 attendees. And one of the things that we've noticed over the years with both doing ERM University and others is that people kind of get tied too much into the lingo, so this is our attempt to kind of de-jargon ERM and to provide some real-life context in how we look at ERM in that way. With that said, I also encourage those that were not able to attend the Risk Summit or the ERM University is that we will be posting most of the presentations online. They were actually videoed, and so once those become available, we'll certainly be sending those out as well. So with that, one of the things that when I look at ERM, one of the things that I do is I kind of, just like the Sixth Sense, I see, when he says he sees dead people throughout, and I kind of take the little turn on that. Is that when I look at the world around me, I don't see dead people. Actually, I see ERM. And it becomes, it's almost one of those things where the lens that I look the world through now is there's so many different examples of how ERM is working, or ERM could have worked in probably a situation, and how an organization could manage its risk. And when you really start looking at ERM in a general sense, we always talk about, risk management is really good management. And why is ERM different, or why do we have to call it something different? And the reality is it's just making people understand at different levels of what their role is in the organization and how they can really help support the mission and objectives of the organization in there. So one of the things that have been in the news lately that I thought I would talk about, and when I talk about ICERM, is 3 different companies that out there. So Google actually made news a couple days ago. Actually yesterday, as a matter of fact, so when I finalize the slides, you'll see some examples from Google, as well as Harley-Davidson was recently news, and finally CVS. And some of the examples with CVS is one of those that I've used in the past. So to kind of get everyone on the same page and foundation, I want to use this kind of the simple definition of enterprise risk management, or at least what the purpose of it is. And the purpose is to identify and manage the many risks throughout the enterprise that affect the organization's ability to meet its objectives. And it's really that key point on ability to meet its objectives, or what its mission is. And so that, again, most people know it can be positive or negative. We can optimize risk. But again, putting that into context can sometimes be a little difficult. So the example I like to give is a school. And so in order for a school, elementary school, in order for it to meet its objectives, you got to have students, right? And the goal and the mission of a K-12 is to educate students to be successful, to pass minimum requirements and standards that are established by the state. Well, a lot of times people, they kind of see, okay, well, the teacher is the most important person in achieving that mission. Well, actually, there's a lot of pieces to the puzzle there. Having served on a school board, I can tell you that a custodian is just as important as well as the bus driver and the person serving lunches. If you don't have transportation to the school, you're not going to be able to meet that mission because you're not going to have as many kids coming to the school. So that bus driver is essential to achieving that mission. So if you find that you're not having students go, how are you going to, and that becomes an obstacle. School, transportation might be one way that you do that. The other idea is that, in order for kids to learn, you want to make sure they have a good learning environment. So you want it clean. You don't want, if a dirty classroom, those type of things, is going to be a distraction to the learning environment. As well as if students are hungry. You see that, students they don't come to school because they might have some issues at home. I can tell you that on the school district that I served on, we kind of had the opposite side of the railroad tracks. One school was very well off in one area, and the other 60% of the students were on free and reduced lunches. And so you really had some disparities, and you had kids that weren't coming to school that didn't have lunches. And so providing the food, to basically nourish the body as well as the mind really became really important. So the idea is when people tie in what they do to the mission of the organization, it's not just someone that's picking up garbage as a custodian or a janitor. They really do serve an important purpose, and it's how to recognize how each and every person in an organization helps support that mission is really where you start seeing value. So when we talk about risk. Obviously most people on this call have been doing this for a while, and we recognize that risk is really present in everything that we do. But if you can imagine, risk is also really about uncertainties. When we have uncertainty in our lives, now we have a risk, and we need to have to balance it out. And so our goal in many cases is to try to get more information, so it becomes less so we are actually be more certain of what the outcome is going to be. So for a university setting, if you can imagine, maybe we're looking at establishing a new curriculum or new program for new business operation. Or let's look at the risk of most universities don't have a enterprise risk management curriculum or program, and we want to look at developing one. So one risk, if we open up that program, is we may not have enough students to justify the new program. We risk paying for the expense of salaries and teachers and staff without having really the income to justify the course offerings. Another view is that we may lose students in the tuition dollars if we don't offer the new curriculum. Another university beats us to the punch and is able to offer a curriculum. So now we may lose students leaving UC to take a class somewhere else. There's also a risk that we may not hire qualified staff or offer a quality education in the field. But then we also have an opportunity to be the first college in higher ed to offer this type of curriculum. So if we're successful, now we draw even more students. So you can kind of see that, the financial stability and reputation that, when you think of risk, it's not just that insurable risk, again, that when we look at a program like that. So if you look at, this is my only jargon I'll use on ISO 31000. The definition that is used within ISO 31000 is risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And again, risk can be a threat or an opportunity using those prior examples in there. And again, anything that could harm, prevent, delay, or enhance your ability to achieve your objectives would be considered a risk as well. So now kind of keeping some of those things in mind and looking at, from a business standpoint, why would we, when we look at risk in ERM, how does that show value? Well, first of all, I think when we recognize our uncertainties or identify our risks, we can improve our strategic decision making. We'll be in a much better position to look to understand the environment in which we operate and make decisions with good information or informed information. We can anticipate risk and minimize threats. Again, by scanning the environment, that's where the ERM aspect comes into play. We can improve business performance. So when we talk about business performance, many times we're talking about improving efficiencies. Every dollar that we spend on an activity that is not core to the mission is basically something that's not in support of, it's an efficiency and it's not in support of what we're trying to do as an organization. And then finally, comply with legal and regulatory requirements. And then the last one, that's kind of, maybe the minimum, the floor, but hopefully with an ERM program, it's going to help us make sure that we do comply with those aspects of it. Again, kind of just using one final definition before we go in. When we talk about ERM, it's really a coordinated effort to direct and control activities related to risk. And this is using the ISO 31000 definition. They don't use the term enterprise in ISO 31000. It's the new, really, definition of risk management is exactly that. It's a coordinated effort. And the goal here, with this is to make sure the responsibility for who manages that risk is really spread across the organization. And that goes back to the risk owners. So I think as we go through and we kind of apply these life examples, hopefully you'll be able to see how this really comes to light here. Well, as a quick background, the types of risk exposures in ERM, I think most people on the call are familiar with the hazard risk, which are those related to accidental losses, workplace injuries, those type of things. The financial aspect typically refers to more currency type of fluctuations, more in the financial markets, but I think for our purposes, it even deals with inefficiencies of how we use money. Operational risk is something that you're all familiar with, but probably the thing that we don't do as well as an organization, and it's really how we looking at our supply chain, customer satisfaction. When we lose key personnel, those all can be operational risks that many times may not be considered. And as well, strategic risk. Now, even though strategic risk is typically evaluated at the board level or at the higher level, there is really strategic risk as well at lower echelons of your hierarchy. So you can still be strategic in the way that you look at certain types of risk at an operational level and at a functional level, and how you're going to go about and implementing a change. Compliance risk is something, again, that I think most are familiar with in the university environment. And lastly, reputational risk is the other big bucket of category. And related to trustworthiness of business or damage to a firm's reputation. Actually, one of the presenters we had at ERM University was Hans Good, and he actually came up with a new definition or related definition that's out there, which is, make sure I got it right now. Essentially was, breaking the public's trust or breaking the social contract. And the idea is by breaking, what's an accepted norm can also be considered a reputational risk. So for those that on the Davis campus are obviously familiar with this, but this is the example of really where reputational risk comes into play. And again, when we look from an ERM perspective, how could you manage a risk like this? And I think the report that came out afterwards really talked about, it didn't mention it specifically, but it actually did say, looking at the risks of anticipating some of these type of events. And really what it was talking about was doing a risk assessment prior to this event probably could have prevented probably this from occurring. Now, obviously with this, there's some insurance that can help, but for the most part, this is really something that's not insurable. And you look at the potential damage that can come from parents wanting to send their kids to the campus, or even alumni donations, as well as the trust with our campus police, because the campus police are actually much different than a normal law enforcement. There really needs to be a relationship there. But then you look at, it's one thing to have a picture, but then you look at what happens by Monday, is then you had all these other images, essentially, that, going viral. And so not only did you have one situation in which made Al Jazeera, but now you have all these different kind of memes that even made the situation even worse. And it's something that, as an organization, you really can't manage. It was outside the scope to be able to handle all these different types of images that were basically going on out there. This is one of my favorite slides that I like to show. And this is from a financial risk standpoint. Again, kind of putting the context of here's real world where ERM can come into play. And this is a chart of, many have seen a presentation I've given before, about electronic W-2s. This is the percentage of employees that receive their W-2s in electronic form. And basically, in 2009 was the first time that this chart was shown to the chancellors, and it was done by our CFO. It's part of our our AIM report, or Actionable Information for Managers report. And the dotted line that you see, the green line up above there, is really that if we get up to that level, is $7 million in annual savings to the university. Well, that savings comes in the form of reduced postage, as well as printing costs, and it really, so that goes right back to that financial risk or the inefficiencies. By doing something as simple as, trying to inform and educate our employees more about W-2s, we'll basically be able to reduce that transfer that $7 million in savings back to the mission of the University of Education, Research, and Public Service. And so this is one of my favorite slides, just because it just shows how simple, what we consider good management to be, or looking for these opportunities to where we can better fund some of those aspects. Now, moving on to items that are outside, and this is, what I like to call the strategic risk aspect, or a good example of that. This is a couple months ago now that, in Forbes had listed, and all the news outlets picked up, was that CVS was going to stop selling tobacco. And the idea here, it talked about sacrificing $2 billion in sales for public health and future growth. So the backstory on this is that essentially the CVS was, looking at the Affordable Care Act and looking at essentially their values, and the idea that there's going to be need for more clinics and more follow-up care, because under the Affordable Care Act, hospitals that see an increase or don't start decreasing their readmit rates may be penalized. And so there's going to be a need to actually have relationships with hospitals. And so what you'll see on here is this is actually within the article where the CEO kind of talked about their decision to go towards, reducing or not selling cigarettes in their stores. And they really see this as a major growth opportunity because of the Affordable Care Act. Because what they're going to call expanding minute clinics, which will now offer primary care, and they're going to expand these from 750 stores to about 1,500 stores in the next 3 years. So tremendous growth. And what they saw there was, and you can see that bolded, the presence of cigarettes in CVS is a strike against its credibility as a healthcare provider. And essentially that they see themselves that as being part of their core mission, and that, have a doctor to say you need to stop smoking, at the same time selling cigarettes would basically send the wrong message. And so this is a really good example, I believe, of you look at strategic, from a strategic risk management standpoint, to make a decision like this, and the implications of really scanning the environment, understanding what's at risk there. So moving on to our next example, which is Google. Now, most people obviously recognize Google because we use it, and it's become a verb now. And how it's as common as kind of like Kleenex being a representation of kind of tissue. And so Google, if you look at their mission, is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And so when you look at what Google's done with information, with having things, the search engine, they're probably the most widely used search engine. And so obviously they have a good market there. But you also look at all the tools that have been developed, and almost all these tools, whether it be Gmail, Google Docs, Drive, they're basically free tools. And so this is part of their business model, is to make, organize and make information accessible and useful. And so when you look at that, now what I showed is the internet users in the world. And basically you can kind of show, you can see the increase over the years, for basically 95 to 97, almost, 10 years ago, or actually, 20 years ago now. And you see the exponential growth really since about 2001. You've seen this huge increase of users. And I think what they're saying is worldwide there's about 3 billion users that are on the internet. Well, that may actually sound like a lot, but to Google, you actually look at it, and this is a chart that shows the world's population in context of that. And so right now, they mentioned, in the previous slide, about 2.9 billion or 3 billion users. And it grew, and you can see the growth is the growth pattern in the is actually going, it's slowly going, it's becoming less. So over the years, the growth is going less. And the world population is about 7.2 billion people. So right now, only 40 billion people, or excuse me, 40% have access to the internet. Now, one of the things, if you're Google, the way they make their revenue is basically on the number of people using their different products because of the advertising. So, there might be some areas that don't have internet. And so how can you continue to have growth if you've kind of maximized your population and as things look like they're going down? And Google is not a service provider. So that's not an area that they're in per se, but they're dependent upon the Comcasts and the Time Warners and all the other kind of service providers that are out there to basically continue the growth mode. And so one of the things that maybe people have not heard of, but this is an area where Google is getting into the act of how can they provide access to get that other 60% that's not out there. And so if you have a link on there, if you get a chance after the presentation, I encourage you to take a look at it. There's a whole bunch of videos. But they actually have what they're calling Balloon for All, balloon-powered internet for everyone. And so this project, when you go on the site, you'll actually be completely fascinated by it, is that they're going to be putting balloons actually at 60,000 in the stratosphere, about 60,000 feet in the air. And these balloons are going to be spread out at that level. And essentially what's going to happen is those service providers' signals will be bouncing off. So they're still not they're not a service provider, but they're giving the opportunity for those service providers to basically bounce their signals off these balloons that can then be throughout in the stratosphere space and basically beam back down to Earth to homes that will have these little receivers that can accept it. They've done tests in New Zealand. They've done it for about over a year now and have found it to be very successful. You'll find all these on the Loon website, all these videos of how it actually works, the technology. And so you look at what their mission is as an organization, to make information accessible, to help organize it. And this really, goes right in accordance with that mission. Now, one of the things, if you think about, the risks involved, obviously there's good things with it, but if you're a risk manager and you're looking at the possibility of having these balloons sitting at 60,000 feet, yes, they might coordinate with air traffic control when they're up there, but what's the possibility of, in this case, a balloon, falling balloon coming out of the sky? This actually happened, if you look at the date, this happened yesterday. So perfect timing for the presentation, but basically balloon causes panic in New Zealand, fallen balloon mistaken for wrecked plane. And so this balloon did come down out of the sky, and a search and rescue helicopter, because it was called in, was looking based upon a call that came out. But Google, in their good estimation, actually just said that we'll pay for any search and rescue costs for people wasting their time. But if you can imagine, with these balloons, how, as a risk man, how do you, make sure that these things just, if it was to come down and a plane's flying by, gets caught in an engine, there's all these different risks that certainly come to mind. So while the goal of doing this is admirable, these are the types of situations that they're going to have to deal with from an ERM perspective. And again, it's not just the cost of having that. I mean, from an operational standpoint, the reputation, if something was catastrophic to happen and people were injured due to one of these balloons coming out of the sky. So this is something that'll be interesting to see. How does this affect Google and what are the safety factors that they may put into place to help prevent this from happening again. And lastly, Harley-Davidson. So last year, Harley-Davidson, there was the RIMS ERM conference in San Francisco. Harley-Davidson won award for the ERM program. And the risk manager, their chief risk officer, talked a little bit about what their black swan event might be. And so this is one of those things where I think it's fairly interesting of how the company's attacking this issue. And if you think about what makes a Harley a Harley, what's iconic about a Harley-Davidson, because there's all these different motorcycles, but there's certain things of why people are going to buy one. And you think about it, it really comes down two things. one, the look and feel, which is that chrome, but it's also the noise. And or some people may call it blasphemy, them calling it noise, but the sound that it makes, the engine rev. You know, basically when a motorcycle drives down the street, you know whether it's a Harley or not, basically by its sound. And so one of the things that the person doing the presentation talked about was their black swan event is in a situation, or because of regulations, that their engines may not sound the same. So maybe because electric motorcycles, or because of fuel efficiency regs or something like that. And so that was really, their black swan is not something, a natural disaster or something like that. It really has to do with the sound. So what's interesting when you look at it is that and again, this is just fairly recent, is that Harley-Davidson's now basically is putting out an electric motorcycle, and they're test driving it actually starting today. So luckily all these things were in the news for me. And so what they're trying to do is they're really trying to tackle, you look from an ERM perspective, trying to take this issue head on. Instead of kind of waiting for these regulations to take effect, can they start looking at a motorcycle that would meet these standards, and also maybe reach a new segment that like the idea of a Harley, but want to, electric. And at this point, the sound is quieter, but my understanding is that there are some discussions about, what kind of sound can they mimic some of the sounds that go along with a Harley. So when you look at these things, between Google and CBS and Harley, hopefully you can kind of see what I call, I see ERM everywhere. You can start looking for these examples almost in everything, in any organization. There's really these operational risks. What can happen? What's the reputational risk by doing these things? And that's what I'm hoping is that too often people get bogged down into the COSO and ISO jargon that they kind of really miss the key point, that there's so much stuff going on that really are risks in other areas. And then how can we look at that from a real life standpoint, and how can we take those into our organization and really start looking at these risks from really just a basic sense of what's the operational risks, instead of trying to talk about them from a framework or standards perspective. So with that, I'll take any questions that are out there. Hopefully people can actually hear, but look forward to answering any questions that you may have. And I think at this point, if you are online, you can either unmute your line as well, so you can ask live, or you can type them in.
Well, and if we don't have any questions now, it is always, of course, possible to email us. You can email erec.young@ucop.edu, or for any general questions about the Toolbox webinars, you can email erm@ucop.edu. So I think if we have no further questions, which it sounds like we don't, I will thank everybody for joining us for this month's Toolbox. We hope to see you next time. Thanks very much.